Ethan Carter has always believed that his home was more than a physical structure. It was a sanctuary built on independence, hard work, and a deep respect for tradition. A decorated military veteran turned city official, with a passion for restoring classic cars and maintaining his beloved suburban property. Ethan's house is his peaceful retreat after years of service. Every brick and every detail of his well-maintained home tells a story of resilience and pride. He takes great care of his property, ensuring that every element, from the meticulously trimmed hedges to the vintage porch lights, is a testament to his personal history and hard-won freedom. But life in his quiet suburban neighborhood hasn't always been harmonious. Overseeing the community with an iron fist is Kerren, the self-appointed queen of the local homeowners association, HOA. Kerren is notorious for her strict enforcement of arbitrary rules and fines that she claims are designed to preserve the community's pristine image. With her perfectly tailored suits, immaculate hair, and a clipboard that seems to be an extension of her hand, Kerren patrols the neighborhood like a vigilante of conformity, determined to stamp out any sign of nonconformity. Ethan's troubles began on what seemed like an ordinary morning until he discovered that his mailbox, an original piece that had been a fixture of his home for decades, was missing. In its place was a hastily installed HOA-approved model that clashed violently with the historic charm of his property. The mailbox wasn't just a means to receive mail. It was a cherished family heirloom that symbolized the legacy of his forefathers. Its theft was not only a personal violation, but an affront to everything Ethan held dear. Furious, Ethan confronted the intruder. He soon learned that Kerren herself had been seen near his property that morning, acting as if her inspection was entirely above reproach. "Ethan, your mailbox is a disgrace," she had said with a condescending smirk. "It doesn't meet our community's aesthetic standards, so it has been replaced with one that does." The word stung, not only because of the audacity of the act, but also because they represented the invasive overreach of the HOA into every aspect of his personal life. For Ethan, this was the last straw. His home, his sanctuary, and the legacy he had nurtured were being hijacked by Kerren's arbitrary interpretation of community standards. As he stood at his front door, now missing its original mailbox, Ethan felt a surge of indignation. He realized that Kerren's actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader campaign to control and micromanage every detail of his life. Determined not to let bureaucratic tyranny trample on his rights, Ethan vowed to fight back, not just for his mailbox, but for the freedom and individuality of his entire home. That evening, as the sunset bathed his property in warm hues, Ethan sat on his porch and reflected on the injustice. The stolen mailbox was more than property. It was a symbol of his independence, and Kerren's intrusion represented an attack on that very freedom. The conflict had been set in motion, and Ethan knew that he would soon have to take action to reclaim what was rightfully his. The stage was set for a showdown between an individual determined to protect his legacy and an overreaching HOA led by a self-appointed enforcer of conformity. The next morning, Ethan awoke to find an official notice affixed to his front door. Embossed with the HOA's crest and signed by Kerren herself, the document accused him of violating community aesthetic standards by displaying an outdated, non-compliant mailbox. The letter demanded that he replace it immediately or face a fine of $750. Every word was drenched in bureaucratic severity, leaving no doubt that Kerren intended to make an example out of him. Ethan's pulse raced as he read the notice. He knew that his original mailbox, far from being an eyesore, was a cherished piece of his family's history. With a steely resolve, he gathered copies of local zoning laws and property rights documents that clearly outlined his legal authority over his home's features. Confident in his rights, Ethan began drafting a formal complaint disputing the fine and questioning the legitimacy of the HOA's overreach. As the day progressed, a sleek sedan pulled up along his driveway. Two uniformed inspectors stepped out, clipboards in hand, and approached his house with the mechanical precision of bureaucrats following orders. "Mr. Carter," one said in a flat tone, "we're here on behalf of the HOA to verify that your property conforms to the established community standards." Ethan met them at the door, his voice calm but firm. "My mailbox is a part of my property's history, and I have every legal right to display it as it is. I am fully compliant with local regulations." Despite his detailed explanation and the documents he presented, the inspectors continued their measurements and note-taking, compelled by Kerren's directive. Soon after, Kerren arrived on the scene herself. Dressed in her trademark crisp suit and armed with her clipboard, she surveyed the situation with a smug air of superiority. "Ethan, you must understand that these rules apply to everyone. If you do not immediately replace that mailbox with one that meets our aesthetic standards, you will incur further penalties," she declared, leaving no room for negotiation before turning and strutting away. That evening, as rain began to patter softly on his roof, Ethan sat in his study surrounded by legal texts and zoning ordinances. The fine was not just a monetary threat. It was a blatant attempt to impose Kerren's personal vision on his property. Determined to fight back, Ethan resolved to document every instance of HOA interference and prepare for the battle ahead. In the days that followed, Kerren's efforts to subdue Ethan's independent spirit grew more aggressive. What started as a single notice soon snowballed into a series of intimidating actions. Ethan began finding multiple violation notices stapled to various parts of his property, each accusing him of different infractions: improper mailbox aesthetics, unauthorized display of historical artifacts, and failure to adhere to community visual standards. The language was legalistic and harsh, designed to intimidate rather than to correct. Rumors began circulating among the neighbors. Several homeowners, who had always admired Ethan's dedication to preserving the character of his property, revealed that they too had received similar notices for minor deviations that previously went unnoticed. One resident confided that fines were mysteriously being imposed on those who did not conform, and whispered suspicions emerged that Kerren was using HOA funds for her personal agenda rather than for community betterment. Determined to get to the bottom of these unfair practices, Ethan installed discreet security cameras around his property, focusing particularly on his mailbox and surrounding areas. Over the next few days, he captured footage of inspectors arriving unannounced, taking measurements, and issuing vague warnings. In one damning clip, an inspector could be seen scrutinizing the angle of the mailbox and jotting down notes as if it were a technical defect. Ethan compiled all this evidence into a comprehensive dossier. His files included photographs of the multiple notices, video recordings of the inspector's visits, and even anonymous tips from neighbors hinting at corrupt practices within the HOA. It became increasingly clear that Kerren's campaign was not about preserving community beauty. It was a personal vendetta aimed at controlling every aspect of his life. When the next HOA board meeting was announced, the community's discontent reached a fever pitch. Homeowners, many of whom had suffered under Kerren's arbitrary fines, began to rally behind Ethan. At the packed meeting, residents clutched printed copies of his evidence and exchanged determined glances as they awaited his address. Taking the stage with quiet resolve, Ethan recounted the timeline of events, from the initial fine for his mailbox to the cascade of subsequent notices. He displayed photographs and video clips that painted a damning portrait of Kerren's overreach, highlighting how fines were issued not for genuine violations, but as instruments of intimidation. The room fell silent as his presentation unfolded, with even some board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. It was clear that the issue had evolved from a mere dispute over a mailbox into a larger battle for the community's right to live free of arbitrary control. The seeds of resistance were firmly planted, and the residents' collective voice was beginning to take shape. Ethan's dossier was not just evidence. It was a rallying cry for justice and a promise that no one's heritage would be trampled by bureaucratic tyranny. One fateful morning, as Ethan was checking the perimeter of his property, he discovered that the latest violation notice had been posted on his mailbox again. Kerren had struck once more, and this time it was brazen. Not only had she replaced his original mailbox with a bland, compliant model, but she had also dispatched a team of inspectors to inspect every inch of the new installation. Their grim expressions and relentless note-taking left no doubt. Kerren was determined to enforce her outdated standards at any cost. Fed up with the constant intrusion, Ethan decided it was time to take action. Drawing on his technical savvy and his desire for creative retribution, he hatched a plan to turn the tables on Kerren. In his garage, Ethan set up a discreet video surveillance system aimed directly at his mailbox, an installation that would not only document any further tampering, but also serve as a deterrent against future theft. The next time Kerren appeared, sneaking through the front yard as if on a covert mission, Ethan's cameras captured every moment. Later that day, when Kerren returned to inspect his mailbox yet again, her stealthy maneuver was caught on tape. The footage showed her bypassing a locked gate, opening the mailbox forcefully, and even handling the contents with blatant disregard. Ethan knew he had the proof he needed. Armed with the incontrovertible video evidence, Ethan decided to escalate the matter publicly. At the following HOA meeting, with a packed room of sympathetic neighbors and frustrated board members, he took the stage. With a calm, measured tone, he played the recorded footage on a large screen for everyone to see. The room fell silent as Kerren's covert operation unfolded before their eyes, every action a testament to her brazen disregard for his property rights. Faces in the crowd showed a mixture of shock, amusement, and anger. Kerren's once imposing aura began to crumble under the weight of the evidence, but she still attempted to defend herself. "I was simply ensuring compliance with community standards," she insisted weakly. But her explanation fell on deaf ears, and the video left no room for doubt. Kerren had stolen his mailbox not once, but again, and this time she had been caught red-handed. Ethan's defiant display was not merely an act of personal vindication. It was a rallying cry for the entire community. The message was clear. If the HOA continued to use its power to violate personal property rights, the residents would not stand for it. The footage became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that technology and persistence could overcome even the most entrenched bureaucratic tyranny. Desperate to salvage her dwindling authority, Kerren resorted to one last drastic measure. Late one evening, after hearing that Ethan's surveillance cameras had caught her latest transgression, she decided to leverage law enforcement in an attempt to turn the tables. With a furious determination, Kerren called the local police and falsely reported that Ethan's persistent noncompliance with community regulations had escalated into a public safety issue. She claimed that his actions were endangering the neighborhood and demanded immediate intervention. Within minutes, a police patrol arrived at Carter's property. The officers, maintaining their professional detachment, met Ethan at the door. "Good evening," Ethan said calmly as he presented copies of permits and zoning documents, all of which proved that his property and his mailbox were entirely within his rights. The officers listened carefully, examined the evidence, and even complimented the clear quality of his surveillance system. Kerren's complaint was quickly debunked. However, undeterred and desperate to regain control, she secretly hired a private investigator to dig up further evidence of misconduct on Ethan's part. That night, as the community slept, the PI attempted to sneak onto the property. But Ethan's hidden cameras, already in place for such eventualities, captured every moment. The footage clearly showed the PI creeping through the garden and attempting to tamper with the camera setup, an unmistakable act of trespassing. At the next HOA meeting, with the community gathered and tensions high, Ethan took the stage once more. This time, he presented both the footage of Kerren's theft and the incriminating video of the private investigator's intrusion. "This evidence," he declared firmly, "proves that Kerren's actions have crossed the line from merely arbitrary to outright criminal. She has stolen my property and then attempted to cover it up by using federal resources to intimidate me." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Kerren's face turned a deep shade of red as she attempted to interject, claiming that her actions were for the good of the community. But the evidence was overwhelming. Later that day, following an internal review and pressure from local authorities, Kerren was arrested on charges of theft and trespassing, violations that, under federal law, carried serious consequences. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. It wasn't just that Kerren had stolen a mailbox. It was that she had abused her power to the point of breaking the law. The footage was unambiguous. and the police action was swift. Kerren's desperate move had backfired in spectacular fashion, leaving her reputation in tatters and her authority irreparably damaged. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Kerren's days as the enforcer of HOA rules were numbered. The community's collective outrage had reached a tipping point, and the evidence against her was damning. Ethan's steadfast refusal to be intimidated had now resulted in a full-scale legal reckoning, and Kerren's final, desperate move had sealed her fate. In the aftermath of Kerren's arrest and the explosive evidence of her misconduct, the community rallied like never before. An emergency town hall meeting was convened in the local community center, a stark, fluorescent-lit room that, on that day, became the stage for a revolution against arbitrary authority. Frustrated homeowners, tired of being bullied by Kerren's overzealous enforcement, gathered in large numbers, armed with copies of Ethan's dossier. Photographs, video recordings, and written testimonies documenting every instance of her abusive tactics. One by one, residents recounted their experiences of arbitrary fines, intrusive inspections, and the erosion of their personal freedoms. The collective anger in the room was palpable, a resounding chorus that declared, "Enough is enough." After hours of impassioned debate, the community voted unanimously to dissolve the current HOA board and remove Kerren from any position of power. The decision was swift and decisive, a clear rejection of the tyranny that had plagued the neighborhood for far too long. News of the vote and Kerren's subsequent arrest spread like wildfire. Local media heralded it as the fall of the HOA tyrant, and city officials quickly launched an independent investigation into the board's financial practices. It soon emerged that funds had been misappropriated to support Kerren's personal vendettas, and numerous fines had been issued with little or no basis in actual violations. The legal consequences were swift. Heavy fines were imposed on several board members, and some faced criminal charges for fraud and mismanagement. For Ethan, the collapse of the HOA was both a personal vindication and a communal triumph. Sitting on his porch one crisp morning, he sipped his coffee as the sun rose over his reclaimed property, now free from the oppressive dictates of Kerren's regime. The community's spirit had been reignited, and the dark days of arbitrary control were now fading into history. Across the neighborhood, the oppressive shadow of the old HOA receded, replaced by a vibrant, self-determined community that celebrated individuality and innovation. Neighbors began openly discussing plans for a new, democratic board that would govern transparently and with the interests of all residents in mind. The era of Kerren's heavy-handed rule was over, and the community looked forward to a future built on mutual respect and accountability. Following the community's decisive action and Kerren's dramatic arrest, the legal system moved swiftly to hold the corrupt HOA board accountable. City inspectors and independent auditors launched a thorough investigation into the board's financial records and enforcement practices. Their findings were damning, revealing a labyrinth of misappropriated funds, baseless fines, and secretive practices designed solely to reinforce Kerren's personal vendetta against nonconformity. Armed with this overwhelming evidence, a coalition of affected homeowners, led by Ethan, filed a class action lawsuit against the former board. In a series of public hearings, Ethan presented his meticulously compiled dossier, video footage of intrusive inspections, photographs of absurd violation notices, and internal communications that exposed the board's systemic abuse of power. The courtroom became a stage for the community's collective voice, as each piece of evidence reinforced that no one was above the law. The judge's verdict was swift and uncompromising. The board was fined heavily, and several individuals faced criminal charges for fraud and mismanagement. In addition, the settlement mandated that all misappropriated funds be redirected toward community improvement projects, and that a new democratically elected board be established to govern transparently. Headlines soon proclaimed the fall of the HOA tyrants, and the case quickly became a beacon of hope for communities fighting arbitrary authority. For Ethan and his neighbors, the legal victory was not just about financial restitution. It was a powerful reclamation of their autonomy. The courtroom drama transformed their struggle into a resounding declaration that the united community would not tolerate abuse of power. The legal consequences dealt a final, crushing blow to the old regime, ensuring that the future would be governed by fairness and accountability. With the legal verdict and public humiliation firmly in place, Kerren's personal world crumbled with alarming speed. Once the iron-fisted enforcer of the HOA's draconian rules, she was now exposed as a petty, overreaching bully. Forced to resign from her position, Kerren found herself isolated. Former allies and board members distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with her tarnished legacy. Her stately home, once a proud symbol of suburban status, was quickly put on the market amid swirling rumors of financial ruin, and whispers spread that her longtime partner had finally left, unable to endure the relentless pressure and public disgrace. Attempts to secure even a modest position in property management were met with derision. At local job fairs, potential employers exchanged skeptical glances whenever her name was mentioned, and the community's scorn was palpable. In one particularly humiliating moment at a city hall meeting, Kerren desperately tried to justify her actions as necessary measures for maintaining community order. Instead, her feeble justifications were met with laughter and pointed remarks, cementing her status as a cautionary tale of abuse of power. For Ethan, witnessing Kerren's downfall was a quiet, deeply satisfying moment of poetic justice. There was no overt celebration, only a measured affirmation that accountability had finally been served. Every public misstep, every financial setback, and every whispered comment reinforced the truth. No one, not even a self-styled enforcer of rules, is above the law. Kerren's personal ruin became a lasting symbol of how tyranny eventually crumbles under the united spirit of a community determined to live free. As summer slowly gave way to a mellow autumn, the community of Carter Marina embraced a new era of freedom and unity. The dark days of arbitrary fines, invasive inspections, and overbearing control were now relegated to cautionary tales, an ugly chapter that the residents had finally closed. Ethan sat on his porch, the fading sunlight reflecting off his reclaimed property, a quiet smile playing on his lips as he recalled the long battle. At a celebratory block party held in the community park, neighbors gathered to toast their hard-won victory over bureaucratic tyranny. Laughter rang out as residents shared humorous anecdotes of the past, especially the day when Kerren, attempting to inspect his farm animals, was chased off by his feisty guard goose. In one particularly memorable moment, a longtime friend produced a comically oversized HOA violation notice, accusing Ethan of excessive mailbox nonconformity and unauthorized federal theft of personal property. With a wry grin, Ethan accepted the faux citation and quipped, "I guess they really did try." The crowd erupted into laughter and applause, a final, resounding mic drop on an era of oppression. As twilight deepened and the party wound down, families and friends lingered together, discussing plans for a future built on transparency, innovation, and mutual respect. The oppressive rules that had once loomed over Carter Marina were replaced by a vibrant, community-led governance system that celebrated individuality and safeguarded personal rights. Sitting quietly on his porch, Ethan reflected on the journey. His mailbox, stolen time and again by an overzealous Kerren, had been restored with the help of a newly installed security camera that not only deterred further theft, but ultimately led to Kerren's arrest for federal theft. The legacy of HOA Kerren's tyranny had been consigned to a cautionary tale, and the united spirit of the community shone brighter than ever. Fade to black.